are trying to get away by then. So just to kind of kick us off in terms of why we chose this theme for the event, I think, following 13 years in power, and with the polls looking quite challenging for Conservatives, we really wanted to think about what the future of the party holds. And certainly, I think, from my experience in the past few days, that's been on lots of people's minds. The two things I'd really like to get into today, and that I hope we can cover both of, one would be the electoral challenge. So, the 2019 coalition perhaps looks quite different now in terms of its sustainability. There are particular challenges around young voters, around women voters, and I'd be keen to understand from our speakers how they're thinking about that electoral challenge. The second thing that I hope we'll get to, is the governing challenge. And there are huge problems facing the UK, very immediate ones, such as the cost of living crisis, and the need to boost economic growth. But also longer term challenges such as environmental breakdown and increasingly polarised society, which are going to take new forms of governance to address. So I hope we can get into some of that. So we'll be talking about the obstacles in a way, some of the policies that are needed, some strategies that are needed. And like I said, hopefully we can have as much discussion and questions from the audience as well. We have a fantastic set of speakers with us today. So we have Rowley MP, Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Local Government for Building Safety. Thank you very much for joining us, Lee. We have the Right Honourable Theresa Villiers, MP for Hitchin Barnet, and Hon Secretary of State. Thank you, Theresa. We are going to be joined by Afolami, MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, in just a moment. And then on my left, we have James Johnson, who is former Senior Opinion Research and Strategy Advisor to Prime Minister Theresa May, and currently founding partner of JL Partners.
Social distancing has come back here.
But I'm sure Ben is joining us shortly. We have it on good word, so that won't be maintained. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to kick us off with some opening remarks. We'll have a bit of discussion and then we'll open it up to you. Check my order. I think Theresa, we will come to you first.
Sure. Well, I'd be delighted to kick off, and there's no doubt that we have a mountain to climb before we can have confidence of securing a fifth general election victory. No political party has ever done that before, but I believe that we can do it if we make the right offer. Whilst there can be little doubt that the final months of the Boris premiership and the Liz Truss's premiership did leave us damaged, but the Prime Minister steadied the ship and restored a much clearer sense of direction, including through the 5 priorities he has set. And I just want to sort of touch briefly on the economy and the environment as 2 crucial areas for the forthcoming general election campaign. Because I think, the key question on polling day for most people is always, who do they trust to run the economy? Who do they trust with the money? And there was simply no way to avoid damage to the public finances, to avoid economic damage, when the country suffered the worst health emergency for a century and the worst energy price shock for half a century. But inflation is coming down, the public finances are recovering. By contrast, every Labour government has left office with higher unemployment than when it entered power. They always spend too much, they always borrow too much, they always end up crashing the economy. For Conservatives, maintaining and rebuilding trust on economic matters is crucial for our electoral chances. After we lost that trust on Black Wednesday in 1992, we did not form a majority government for 23 years, and we didn't win a decent, reasonable working majority for 30 years, which is an illustration of how important these issues are. So the case we have to make is that the Conservatives can be trusted to safeguard the economy, and the economy is in safer hands with us. And I believe that in due course, that offer that we make to the electorate does need to include some reductions in tax. Of course, we can only do that when inflation is under control and there's sufficient headroom in the public finances, but there's every reason to believe that may become possible in the period between now and the election, putting us in a position to include tax cuts in our manifesto. And secondly, on the environment, we need to get the balance right on this. For me, the environment is a crucial issue to me personally, not just protecting the climate, but protecting the natural environment and reversing the disastrous deterioration in natural habitats. But I think the ULEZ controversy in the Amesbury by-election show that we have to find a way to get to net zero, which works with the grain of how people live their lives. And I think there is a broad public commitment to action to protect the climate and nature, but we won't succeed in reaching net zero without some pragmatism. And I think the changes signalled by Rishi on the deadlines for ending the sale of petrol and diesel cars and replacing gas boilers, they were pragmatic. They left, the core machinery for delivering net zero remains as ambitious as ever, but they are an acknowledgement that we have to take people with us if we're going to do this. And the other advantage is it's another way of opening up a clearer choice and clearer blue water between Labour and the Conservatives. And this is starkly illustrated in London. As a London MP, I'm very much London focused. And here we have the very poor record of Mayor Khan showing that if you vote Labour, you get new taxes and charges, you get poorer services, and you get 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. So that is all good reasons to return a Conservative government next time around.
Thank you very much, Theresa. Lee, can I come to you next?
Sure. So I'll spend only a few seconds in terms of what I think we need to do in the next few months in order to win the election, because I want to talk more broadly about what Conservatives needs to do in the next 20 years or so. So in terms of what we need to do, I think it's pretty clear. There is no love for Labour in my constituency. I don't think there's much love for Labour across the country as a whole. What we have to do is offer responsible, proportionate, careful government. We've got to calm the whole thing down. Whatever we think of what happened last year, it went into a place that nobody wanted it to be. So it's all going to get calmed down. We're going to demonstrate to the electorate again that we are determined to try and move things forward. The electorate aren't idiots. They understand that the last few years have been difficult, building on a number of challenges over 10 years plus. So if we can make the case that we are making progress, that we are working through the problems, that we are dealing with the issues, then I think that they will give us a hearing. And if they give us a hearing, then there is a pathway to victory at the next election. But that's the very short term. But the question for those Conservatives, those of us who are Conservatives here, is what we do over the next 20 years. It is how you make the case for conservatism in a more connected, a more interconnected, a more technologically aware, a more populous, a more busy world, a more urban world, all of which the conservative movement across the world doesn't have a massive playbook that they can just pull off the shelf on at the moment. Traditionally, the centre-right, as in the centre-left, the ideas come from Australia, America, the UK, some from Europe, but primarily a lot of the ideas tend to have come from America and the centre-right. What's happened over the past half decade or so with Trump, don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, but what's happened is the level of ideas that have come out of America have been pretty minimal, and they're not my kind of ideas as a conservative, if I'm honest. And so we have a gap in terms of the idea generation within centre-right politics, and we have to resolve that pretty quickly. That is nothing to do with our Prime Minister, who I am massively in support of. He's doing a really good job in difficult times. It is about taking the uber long view about how we make sure conservatism is successful when I'm in my 60s, as opposed to when I've been in my 30s and my 40s. And so we've got a job to do to understand and renew. And my suggestion is it's something along the following: tell the truth. The thing that Rishi did a few days ago on net zero was one of the most heartening things I've seen in politics for a while. It is actually levelling with the country about some of the challenges and getting out of the fantastical, which for whatever reason we have been in. That is not a reflection on the importance of the subject. It's about being clear that government's job is to be able to deliver, not just to say. Point two, government needs to do some things well, not lots of things badly. Ultimately, we have had a difficult 13 years. We've made lots of progress. I'm proud of what we have achieved. But over 20, 30, 40 years, conservatism has got to work out what it wants to do in government, and it's got to focus relentlessly on what that is. Thirdly, We've got to recognise that there is a big discussion coming between the producers and the consumers once again. It's not something that is talked about particularly in a lot of detail, but that's the reality. All of these strikes, that is all about producers trying to take greater control over ultimately things which people have to pay for at the end of that process. And that's going to continue unless we work out how to prevent it over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Fourthly, we have got to avoid creating guilds. I am a historian. For the last 9 centuries, part of the problems within societies that are created is that guilds are created. People with knowledge, people with expertise, people with skills, and they exclude. We cannot build up barriers to entry into jobs, into skill. We cannot create thresholds, which means that ordinary people in my part of the world, in North East Derby, can't get on in life. I'm not saying that's happened in the last 13 years, but you can see it across the Western world that there is a slow movement towards that. Fifthly, and finally, we have got to, as Conservatives, without exception, prioritise meritocracy above all else. No excuses, nothing else. It is we are meritocrats or we are nothing. And all this stuff, all this identity politics, all this thing where I am more important by the label I choose myself or the physical characteristics that I am, Conservatives have to sweep it away. It does not work. I did not want to go to university because I was northern, gay and working class. I wanted to go to university because they wanted me at university and thought that I would have been the person who could have achieved the most out of that university. If we are not meritocrats, we are not.
Thank you very much, Lee. Viv, everything.
Well, I mean, I'm a friend of Lee's and I respect him deeply, and I think now you will know why he's such a valued member of our parliamentary party. I think that was really excellent. I don't mind me saying so. What I would say about where does conservatism go next is I would really think about 2 axes. And I think about the axes of culture and economics. And I think about those 2 things. So keep those 2 things in your head. Now, it is, and actually, I've been talking to James Canagasora, who some of you know, you'll know very well. He's a pollster, the guy who came up with the Red Wall. He's a good friend, and I speak to him about this a lot. We were doing a panel earlier on today, or was it yesterday? It almost into one. All talking about this question of culture and economics. And since the Scottish referendum, certainly since the Brexit referendum in 2016, it has been in vogue for many people, commentators and conservative politicians and activists alike, to say what matters is culture. Look, we're in a post-economics age. Culture is what's driving politics. All sorts of articles in this regard, and a lot of people buy into that. I'm not saying culture has nothing to do with politics. Of course it does, and of course some people vote on what they perceive to be cultural issues. Of course they do. However, a lot of the evidence and a lot of the thinking right now is that a lot of the cultural questions are actually downstream of the economic circumstances. So when you see graduates who are in low-earning jobs that aren't graduate jobs, and they feel they're cheated by the system, and they take on certain left-wing ideas or become obsessed by identity politics, that is as much driven from an economic consequence of where they feel they are as a cultural one. So what I'm trying to say is where conservatism needs to go next is it needs to have a narrative and an agenda and a program for government. And I completely endorse what Lee was saying. Actually having a plan for what you want to do is better than not having one. That unites both of these aspects of politics because they're completely intertwined. I think there are 2 key aspects there. And as I say, I think it's driven from the economic. The first is we absolutely need to sweep away this aim for zero risk in our culture. All risks must be taken away. That means more regulations, it means more government spending, it means more government interference. Something goes wrong, we need a new rule. Something happens, oh, we need a new body. When all of this happens, each individual thing doesn't necessarily make a huge difference, but when you add it up over time, you really grind the economy down very, very slowly. And I think that comes as a result of us not having enough of that feeling that what makes us wealthy, what makes us prosperous is ultimately risk takers and people taking risks in the economy. So I think that we need to get a better sense of that. The second thing we need to do is and this is difficult to say, but we have to be very, very honest about where in the past certain people felt left behind from what they perceived to be government conservative policy. I think of people who feel that their regions of the country were let down, or they feel that their industries, in the post-industrial age, they still go back to the 70s or 80s and say, well, actually, it was some sort of, it was a sort of conservatism of that time that let my area down. I think we need to be honest enough to build and to use government actively. That doesn't mean government should be bigger. It needs it to be more strategic, more agile and active in certain ways. And I pick certain industries in that regard. I pick certain aspects of the green. I know you mentioned net zero, but certain aspects of the environmental agenda. I think of wanting to build more nuclear power. You can't do that without government being really involved. But then there are other areas where government should be less involved. It's about looking at where government can be useful and where it can't, and being very honest about that. And releasing the energies of the free market where we can, and in other areas saying, no, actually, the government needs to take a lead here, and we're going to do it. So I think that's the other thing we need to do. And the final thing, or rather where I'd finish, is that this point I'm talking about in terms of culture and economics. I think having a plan that can give people a sense that if we can put fairness, meritocracy, or as the book by Adrian Wooldridge, which I'd urge you all to read last year, said, an aristocracy of talent in everywhere in the country, in every single school, in every single business, in every single community. An aristocracy of talent, i.e. not a caste that you are born into, but something to everybody can reach, because everybody has a God-given talent, and that talent, with hard work, with the right opportunity, equals good results. Having that as our lodestar is another significant part of a conservative future that I'm afraid too many people at the moment are a bit too muddled about. And I think we need to clarify that, not just for the next election next year, but for going forward after that as well.
Thank you very much for those remarks. James, thank you.
Yeah, so I'll split it into two. What's the future of conservatism look like for the Conservatives to continue existing after the next election versus where it needs to go next? And look, I think
you were getting very interested.
Yeah, I know.
You've gone very
I'm going to be skeptical to start with, and then go longer term. Look, Theresa's seat is Hipping Barnet, Lee is North East Staffordshire. I think a really important thing to stress is that those two constituencies have more in common than things they have that divide them. The red wall and the blue wall, or whatever we want to call it, we love putting things into categories, but they're actually broadly quite similar. And the two sides of the Conservative coalition in 2019 look much more similar than the Conservative coalition looked in 2010 or 2015. There, the Conservatives had to balance gaining seats in places like the North and the Midlands with places like Brighton, Kent Town, Warwick and Leamington, Battersea, seats which had much younger people, more graduates, very socially liberal. Those people who left the Tory coalition, they left it in 2017, and you can obviously still win an election without them. Those people in the red wall that we won in 2019 look very different from the people, look very similar to the people in the South as well. So I think that's the first thing to say, is that these dividing lines that we've been talking about, whether it's net zero or immigration, they're not necessarily driving a wedge between those two parts of the Tory coalition. You can bring people on the journey on both of them. And I think that the Prime Minister and Number 10 have obviously been doing their focus groups very diligently, because they've picked up on this theme of both the need for a long-term plan and the need for change. And you're absolutely right that Rishi Sunak has to pose himself as the answer to things that have come, a change that's come, a change compared to what's come before. And that is by saying, people have chased your votes before just to be popular. Keir Starmer's going to chase your votes just to be popular. I'm going to give you the decisions and the leadership that you need and that I think is right. Because when we ask people in focus groups, well, who would be good when they're bemoaning all the politicians? They usually land on either Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair. And the reason is because they say, even if we disagreed with them, at least they stood for something. At least they had some backbone. And that's the sort of place that Rishi Sunak needs to inhabit. It's a kind of anti-populist populism. He sort of needs to stand there and go, Keir Starmer's promising you the world. He's lying to you. I'm going to give it to you straight. And that's a big opening for the Conservative Party. A 10-year plan, talking about the long term, really, really important. Building on the sort of real concerns there are about Labour, Rishi Sunak's biggest gift at the next election will be Keir Starmer. He is really still not liked in the focus groups. He is seen as a flip-flopper. He's seen as weak, people pleaser. I think we have slimeball quite a lot, a bit harsh, I'd say. Smarmy. People don't think he's in it for the right reasons. They think he's in it just to get elected. And they're already saying in the focus groups, is he measuring the curtains? Is he already complacent about winning? So there is a huge opening on Keir Starmer. At the moment, people are voting, saying they'll vote for him because the Conservatives have made such a mess of it. And a lot of those 20-point leads are where, this time last year at this conference with Liz Truss, they looked at it, they said, screw these guys, and the 20-point lead was locked in for Labour. My view is that actually when they tune back in again, we'll find that lead is very soft indeed. And actually, there's been a lot of hesitations about Keir Starmer. It's certainly worth stressing when we talk about comparisons of 1992, 1997. It is worth stressing just how rare a thing Tony Blair was. He was a really, really good politician that people respected, and he could communicate, and he sort of caught the zeitgeist. Keir Starmer is not that person, and that will show through. And our most recent Times Radio focus group, because we're a serious intellectual polling firm, we asked them of the main three party leaders, who would you snog, marry, and avoid? And people,
At least it was that version.
yes, family friendly firm, family friendly. And people generally have the view that lots of people wanted to snog Ed Davey. You're very trusting in him. It's terrible. And they wanted to sort of give him a try. People wanted to marry. Some people wanted to marry Rishi Sunak because he's rich. And they wanted to sort of avoid Keir Starmer because he's sort of easy. Because he's easy to avoid. You can avoid someone didn't know who he was. Because he's easy to avoid as a result. But the majority of you was marry Keir Starmer. And the reason people gave was summed up brilliantly by one lady who said, "I'll marry Keir Starmer because." Just because, and that's the problem for Labour right now. They haven't finished that sentence. They haven't got the why, which is absolutely crucial. Just a quick bit on the future, because obviously, the Conservatives could be re-elected, or indeed they could be in opposition. And they're going to have a huge sort of reckoning moment about what they stand for. Now, pollsters will tell you that the ideal blend, taking the culture and economics axis there, is to be, socially conservative on cultural things and to be sort of more activist on the economy. Now, if you just step back and look at the polling, that is probably right. But I think a really important thing for us as pollsters to do is to not just say the public think it, therefore it is the right thing to do and you should do it. The public are very leadable, and whatever vision of conservatism it is, they can be taken on that journey if the leader is convincing and if the vision is convincing. So there's a lot of flex. It's usually in your guys' hands, really, which direction the Conservative Party takes, and that can be very positive. I think if I had to say sort of an easiest opportunity for the Conservatives, both at the next election and in the future, is to be the party of emergence of order and responsibility. And let me tell you quickly what that means. If you're, if you're sort of going to walk on the streets and you're worried about criminals and being mugged, if you're worried about the illegal immigrants in a hotel down the road, if you're worried about working really hard but seeming that some people seem to claim benefits who you might feel are not deserving of it, if you're worried because your child comes home from school and says they want to transition to another gender, the Conservatives tapping into that and saying we will actually be the ones who not protect you from these changes, but harness these changes and make sure that they work for you, that we make your life sort of feel more stable and secure, and really sort of making clear that actually people have responsibility in society, and they need to respect that. No 15-minute cities or world governments, please. There's a sort of terminally online things that have infected the Conservatives, Republicans in the US, and shouldn't be allowed to get into the UK Conservatives. It just looks bloody weird. And that's it really. I think the anti-populist populism, that is the way that the Conservatives can win again. And as I say, it's in your hands, because actually the public can be led and should be led. You don't want people like me telling you that you should do what the public here. If you had polled the iPhone 2002, people would go, I'm not doing that. I want to feel the phone in my hand. I want to feel the buttons. You need the politicians to set the agenda and then let the polling follow.
Thank you very much. And Ben, I think you wanted to jump straight.
Yeah, I mean, to embrace my inner Steve Jobs. one thing I didn't mention, and I'm sort of putting this both to the audience and you guys, and also to you, James, having, you look at data and polling all day, is something I've become increasingly concerned about. I'd be interested, obviously, my fellow panelists using this as well, is younger people aged under 40, 45, and seeing, I did some work with Onward, think tank, about this. It was really startling how differentially this group is behaving and thinking about politics to older generations. And I'm not just thinking about 18, 19-year-olds. I'm not just talking about people who are sort of students who have, students generally speaking, even, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, trended left. Like, that in and of itself is not surprising. I'm talking about people who are into their mid-40s now. And housing is a hugely significant issue. Their taxes, they think, are too high. They feel under real economic strain and difficulty. And anybody who spent any time with a group of people in their 30s, let alone 20s, will often tell you that. I'm just interested as to whether people think, having watched the Canadian Conservatives leader, Pierre Poilievre, I think is how you pronounce it. He is leading the polls big time in Canada. And he has flipped the Conservative voting coalition in Canada to be going from looking a bit like ours, which is broadly speaking older, to being actually him leading amongst younger voters. And he's done that in the space of sort of 3-4 years of hard work. And I just wondered whether you thought that an appeal to younger people, very specifically, very targeted, and accepting that you forego some support from older people if they feel that you're not targeting them. To what extent do you think in this country over the next 5-10 years, that's going to be necessary for the Conservative Party? Because people are not, at the moment, becoming more conservative as they age. That is not happening. And if that happens for long enough, then you really end up losing general elections by big, big margins. So I'm just wondering your view on that.
Well, you could take the 2019 platform and use that, to win a couple of elections. But you're absolutely right. By the time you get into the 2030s, the demographic challenge means that is a very different voter coalition that you need to assemble, and it is younger. And it does require putting those things front and centre. Housing is absolutely key, as you say, but also sort of feeling that there's something. There's one thing that IPPR talks about a lot. Feeling that you have a sort of stake in society, feeling that you actually, it means something. So that's absolutely key. All I would say is sort of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In that younger people have parents and grandparents too, and it's fascinating on the intergenerational fairness stuff. Think tanks talk about it a lot. And indeed lots of sort of young conservatives are talking about it on Twitter all the time. Oh good God, how can you continue the pension triple lock or whatever it might be? But actually, when you test these ideas in focus groups and with the public, the younger voters are just as against getting rid of those things as the pensioners are, because that's their parents or their grandparents. They don't see it as young versus old. So I think, I don't think you're suggesting that for the slightest bit, but I think some people do take the younger thing and contrast that against the position for older people. Actually, you've got to have that consensus view. And 2019, the voters that the Conservatives won in that election, the average age was one of the lowest, because when you have an appealing platform overall, it actually tends to appeal to quite a lot of the electorate, and then that means that your average age is younger. But yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial. The other thing is, of course, that 18 to 29-year-olds do look quite different, and there's a big gender split. So if you look at the data on 18 to 29-year-olds, you might go, oh, Conservatives are off the map, no chance. If you look at 18 to 29-year-old men, they're a lot more likely to be Conservative. They're also, by the way, a bit more likely to think like Andrew Tate or Lawrence Fox. So it's not an easy, this is not an easy win for Conservatives. They're quite sort of, they're very sort of cultural Conservatives and very sort of online and, have sort of other slightly worrying views. But there is an opening there, and indeed a risk that actually female 18 to 29-year-olds are also trending leftwards.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask the panel about another aspect of the 2019 platform, which is levelling up. So I think in some ways the beauty of the levelling up agenda is that it married a promise of meritocracy with an electoral strategy, and yet I certainly don't think there is a strong sense that agenda has succeeded. And indeed, with the HS2 debate over the past few days, I think a lot of people, particularly in regions across the north, will be wondering where that promise is. And so I want to ask the panel kind of what happened, but also is there a space for a levelling up 2.0 in conservatism and how that should play into it. Leo.
Can you come to me last? I'm just going to perform an experiment whilst you come. I'm going to look something up.
I can do Theresa, do you want to?
I mean, I think one of the enormous challenges of levelling up is it's a very long-term project. I mean, that achievements have been made, and we've just had big announcements to support town centres, which are hugely helpful over recent days. But a lot of these projects just take years to deliver. I mean, a particular interest of mine is skills and apprenticeships, and they're obviously a way to enhance individual economic opportunities and also sort of raise productivity and economic opportunity across the region. And yet actually, you know, the reforms that have been made are excellent. 5.1 million apprenticeship starts since 2010, but it's still proving immensely difficult for those changes to feed through into people's changed perceptions about the lives they're leading. And, you know, it may be years into the future before some of the decisions and the spending that are being made now start to have that impact. But I mean, I think, yes, as you say, one of the beauties of the levelling up sort of approach is it is entirely in line with long-standing traditional conservative values that we are about ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to get on and succeed in life. If they work hard and they do the right thing, they can be rewarded. And levelling up is just the latest manifestation of it. But it is also the case that government's been grappling for 100 years to try and ensure that the economy evens out and that the North and the Midlands are as prosperous as the South. We are making progress, but it's going to take a while.
Space for it in the agenda. Ben, do you agree?
I mean, look, it's obviously critical. Harold Macmillan, when he was Prime Minister, wrote an amendment to his cabinet in December 1962, where he says the two greatest challenges we have for this parliamentary term, and you can look this up, this is in Peter Hamilton's book, the two greatest challenges we have are regional disparities of growth and difficulties with Europe. That is what he thought were the two major challenges we have. And the reason why I mention that is simply that this is not a new problem. And one of the difficulties is that I think the way how some people interpreted levelling up when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, though I don't think this was necessarily all Boris's fault, is they interpreted levelling up as basically zero sum. There was money going to the South, we were going to distribute some of that money to them. That was what levelling up meant. Now, that was never going to be ultimately successful because the only way you truly level up is by building the economic foundations and the economic opportunity to make lasting change. And so that really is our challenge, is to show different parts of the country that have rightly really bought into levelling up. And actually, you know, speak to a lot of businesses, a lot of investors, they were buying into levelling up as well. It wasn't just a political thing. Actually, people with capital to move and spend were actually saying, yeah, we're into levelling up too. And they were constantly trying to show that they wanted to do levelling up. So it did capture something. And really our job over the next year, and hopefully after that, if we get through the election, is how do we show that if you live in parts of the country that maybe appear forgotten, and like I said at the beginning, maybe it's post-industrial and they feel they don't have the opportunities they had in previous generations, that the government's going to help put the economic foundations in place so that their children and their grandchildren will have as good opportunities as people in constituencies like mine in Hertfordshire.
Thank you. James, how are local school engaging with units?
Well, I think that point about continuity and how this is a repeated theme is absolutely right. I mean, if you haven't read J.B. Priestley's English Journey, do. It's an amazing book, written in the 30s. And so many of the things that
A lot of historians on the panel. Very keen on history on this panel.
One of the things, you know, it talks about hollowed out town centres, it talks about, you know, fading industry, talks about a more atomised society. This is before really even the rise of the car. But and he actually talks about places that are in the levelling up agenda, Teesside and other parts of the north. So you know, these are constant constant themes. I do think Boris Johnson set a track for, I mean, arguably originally himself and then the wider Conservative Party, because it was too short term. And, you know, he explicitly said, give me my trust and I will, you know, turn your place around. And I remember doing focus groups in January of 2020 in Darlington, incredibly positive. You know, everybody speaks about voters having no trust in politicians, but they really did think things were going to change and they were really excited about it. And obviously that is not really possible in that period of time, as Theresa says. So it's a long-term answer. If I was, I mean, look, you can't fight in the next election on levelling up, because if you do, you know, Conservatives will lose by a landslide, because 70% of people in the red wall in a poll that we did at the start of this year say their area has got worse, not better, in the last 5 years. So if you go on that and try and sell that message, they'll just go off you go. The best thing I think for Rishi's to do, in the vein of what we were talking about earlier, the long term versus the short term, the hard decisions versus the easy ones. If I were him, I'd consciously sort of kill off the term and say this was a too easy a fix. You know, previous prime ministers, in Boris Johnson, which is not afraid to do. You know, he did it with Theresa and he did it with Liz Truss. Have made have basically made this sound too easy. It's not easy, and it's a long-term process. It means we'll need to upskill this industry, do this on education, do this on state sort of spending, and then he might be able to sort of take voters with him. But levelling up as a concept is I'm afraid, as an electoral asset, dead for the Conservatives. It's actually the opposite now.
Thank you. Lee, we're ready to do
Sure.
experiment.
Well, as of 1842 on Tuesday, the 3rd of October, I have no idea what is going to happen with HFT tomorrow or any other day. But I can tell you that at least on my focus group, which is my inbox, there has been precisely 5 emails from constituents of North East Derbyshire about HS2, 4 of whom said you should have cancelled it years ago. So now I have no knowledge of what the policy is, and I have no knowledge of even if the policy is going to change. But my constituents are much more bothered about buses than HS2, and they're much more bothered about the regeneration of their high streets than they are about, in the nicest possible way. It'd be nice for me if I'm still an MP in 20 years about high-speed trains backwards and forwards. They are important for our country, just like infrastructure is important for our country, and I don't mean to diminish it in any way. But in terms of the average response that I would get in somewhere like Kilmarsh or Clay Cross, that would not be the first thing on their list at HS2. And then the second point is my personal view is conservatism is strongest when it is unified. And so, to James's point, we should look for things which marry both the residents of Chipping Barnet want and the residents of North East Derbyshire. And I think there is a lot more there's a lot more in common, as James indicates, than there is that is not there. And I've been supportive of the concept of levelling up. I work in the levelling up department, but it needs to be seen as a whole country approach. There is some unique elements of what's going on in parts of areas like mine. I grew up there, I was born there. We do, it is absolutely right to say that we didn't feel listened to for 40 years. It's one of the reasons why I got into politics, that we were flown past on the train, we were driven past on the M1, nobody took any notice. The political cartel, which was re-elected with 15,000-20,000 majorities and ran the councils for the entire time, took no notice. And that was broken. And I have a lot of issues with Boris, but he managed to break that, and he managed to break through into a discussion and a debate. And the best areas where levelling up has started to move is where that discussion and that debate continues. You go to one of my second largest towns, Clay Cross, home of Dennis Skinner, and you go and talk to people there about how things are changing. And I don't disagree with James's point about how we've still got to demonstrate the benefits of levelling up. We absolutely have to, all across the country. But people in places like Clay Cross are seeing a difference before their eyes. And it's not just about the physicality of what is changing in the area, it's the fact that they're being listened to and they're being asked and they're back in the discourse. And that's the important thing about levelling up, because it means you can have a conversation with people again.
That's interesting. So I'm going to open up to questions, and I'm going to take a few at a time. I've got one. Sorry,
Right, Sue Kane from Westminster. I'm going to be knocking on a lot of doors in the next year, and And what I've asked Lee as a senior politician, Theresa, please don't ask me to defend the indefensible. And the thing that Rishi's enacted recently about putting back the timetable for electric cars and gas boiler replacements is very important. With electric cars, I can at least say, you know, they'll get cheaper, blah, blah, blah. But Lee, you know the composition of housing in Westminster. And it's true in a lot of other places, there is no room in people's homes for heat pumps. There is nowhere for them to put the wiring and everything up, apart from the con. So can we be realistic about that and offer an alternative which they can use? Because I can't stand on the doorstep and tell somebody who lives in a studio flat in Maida Vale that they can get a heat pump in their postage stamp kitchen. And just second point, I was going to say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the thing we need for the older generation is the commissioner for old people and aging. They reckon, Age UK reckon there are now 6 million people who are digitally excluded, a lot of them older, and we need that focus to stop us being treated like we're dead.
Thank you very much. A question right here from.
Thank you, Alex Bob. Nice to see familiar faces on both ends of the drawing room. So I'm actually working for HL2 now, formerly Oxford CCHQ. A lot of things that I'm seeing in the polling, and it's probably a question for James primarily, is I voted to leave. I don't have any qualms about what's happened and the dividing line between that. But if we're talking in broader context of the question of where does conservatism go next, you only have to walk around the auditorium to see the old faces that were withdrawn for the whip that are still going around as members of the card-carrying party. And we talked about the younger generation as well. So how much is that a contributing factor still to voters' intentions? Because I went to the Ipsos stuff around Beyond the Bubble, the stuff with Lord John Hayward earlier that you were in with Tories in Comms. Again, Brexit's not mentioned. So is that now just off the voters' intentions? Because when I'm on the doorstep, that is coming up, that a lot of disinfected Tory voters just will not vote Conservative anymore. So I'm just wondering how much of an importance that is still.
And one of them here.
Callum from Southampton. Speaking of levelling up, is that I think there is a real danger of leaving yourself behind, especially when there are massive pockets of deprivation that when you're knocking on the door, people are like, well, they don't care about us, they only care for the North now. Where, you know, people in Southampton, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Bournemouth, Brighton, they're having just as much of a hard time as, you know, these northern cities, and they're like, well, everyone seems to think we're rich, I'm not rich, you know. And you know, I live in a council, say, in Southampton. I'm not in the worst position in the world, I know it, but there are some people who really are struggling. I think there's a real danger of, you know, leveling up just being on the south, which sometimes shame with Rishi, like see the leveling up announcements from it's got to be Southampton, you know, now Rishi knows it, there's nothing. So it's the danger of leaving the south behind.
Thank you. And I'll take one more. I think there was one there.
Chris here from Solar Energy UK. So I want to bring us back to the climate change and net zero question. So if we look at the next 10, 20 years, climate change is only going to get worse. The impacts are going to get more severe. So that's just that's just scientific facts. I mean, that's something which future conservatives are going to have to face. I think the way that the Prime Minister's speech a couple of weeks ago was framed was very damaging for investors in the energy transition. So strangely, the actual policy changes were quite minor, but the way it was communicated was clearly a nod to climate denial, those who want to slow down the response to climate change. The sort of the meat tax, 7 bins, it was a culture war response to a sort of picking up a sort of fairly small policy change actually, and that didn't just that offended that worried large sections of the business community, the entire energy sector, with possible exclusion of oil and gas. lots of sensible businesses who are trying to invest in improving their carbon reduction and reduce their energy bills. They were surprised and shocked by that. And I think that's something we to reflect on.
Thank you very much. Now, I want to get through as many questions as possible, so I'm not going to ask each of our panelists to answer every question, but rather to address one of them. And perhaps if we start with that net zero one, Theresa, I wondered if you wanted to start there in terms of how the Conservative Party should be reflecting on the response of business in particular to the net zero changes.
Yes, I'm completely committed to delivering on our net zero promises. I completely agree that the impact of climate change is going to be felt more and more clearly over the years to come. And I also agree that the changes announced by the Prime Minister, whilst they're important, they leave intact, the main architecture of the government's climate policy. So in some ways they're not a radical change. And I think that is a sensible move by the Prime Minister, because he's recognising that we've got obligations. It's going to be very difficult to deliver on net zero, but he's taking action to ease that transition and make sure that we do not impact on household budgets and we go with the grain of how people live their lives. But the Prime Minister would be the first to recognise that you have to create as much certainty as possible in this transition if you're going to persuade the business community to invest in these, this huge transition, and particularly on the car deadline, aligning us with many other developed countries around the world. I think, yes, I can understand the anxiety felt that there was a change in direction, but also, many of these global car operators do deal in markets around the world. So aligning our dates with the European Unions and a number of US states, I very much hope is something that the car sector can adapt to. But you will have seen in terms of the international commitments, the Prime Minister, for example, is unrelenting in his determination to deliver on those environmental commitments.
So it's the means of communication in terms of the way it's communicated. There was people in New York shocked by what the UK government was saying in the middle of climate week. And that was mainstream businesses, not
the rhetoric does shape business decisions as well.
And there's the Prime Minister's communications team are not, they're not blind to this. They knew.
Sorry, I have to. This country has the best record of climate movement of any country by far in the entire Western world. This country was the earliest to come out with a clear plan, and the overall objective of that plan has not changed. This country has been successful in developing new technologies and in providing great clarity for the business community and others. I'm hugely pro-business about that. But the very idea that you create a document and that document has to last 31 years in our public discourse, that there won't be any change to the secondary aspects of that document. I'm sorry, I worked in change management in business for 15 years. That's not a reasonable proposition to make. It's just not a reasonable proposition to make.
And we also have Sue's example of where heat pumps are just massively impractical in certain places. And so the Prime Minister's announcement was just a recognition that, we do have to decarbonise our homes and how we heat them, but the current mechanics of doing it are just undeliverable for many people.
What do you want to ask? Do you want to do something else?
No, go for it.
I'm happy to do something else. I was actually thinking, maybe I should come on this. It's a bit hot.
Go for it.
Okay. Look, I was in the chamber of the House of Commons when we passed the net zero target into law. I was there. And what struck me were two things. First of all was how few people were there. And secondly, how few people who weren't there actually knew at that time. So it went through on the nod. And in Parliament, if there's not a debate, if you don't have a vote, quite often, you don't actually know something's happening in the chamber. This would never happen to my colleagues. It happens to me, where you don't actually know something's happening, right? And there are lots of people who didn't actually know we had done it. Okay. And I make this point to say it's really, really important. And the Prime Minister's been clear that we've got to take people with you. It's actually also true that the broader political community really needs to be able to engage with something properly and think about the plan in a practical way. And I think that what the Prime Minister now, where I agree with you is that I think that because it was a leak, it was so messy, the communication of it, and I think that that is just true. I think when things are leaked in that sort of way, it was really messy. The fact that the Prime Minister came out the next day and they had to do a hastily arranged press conference, it shows you that they understood the severity of the way it was leaked and the way that it was. So I think the framing, it's difficult because of how that happened. But as you agree, as you say, the policy was, the movements are relatively minor, but it does tell me one thing, though, more broadly about the agenda. I do not accept this growing trend that I think both parties have been part of over the last 25, 30 years, which is to take more and more things out of democratic debate. I think it's a problem when it comes to the Bank of England. I mean, I don't want to talk about that now, we'll part that. But I do think it's a problem when you're dealing with something as important as inflation, that we can't talk about certain things. We don't have a right to democratic politicians to engage in certain things. I think that's a problem. And I also think it's a problem in this area. That doesn't mean that everybody in this room, or indeed everybody in Parliament or in the Conservative Party, will agree on every single aspect of what the Prime Minister may or may not do in relation to this. But it should be subject to debate and discussion. And I think that is a very important thing. And I think what you're going to see in Europe, I was in Germany recently, speaking to lots of CDU politicians and SPD, listening to them about the political impact of what's happening in Germany with what the Greens forced through in the coalition is quite sobering. And I do not want us to get to the position where the equivalent of the AfD is likely to win 3 states in the east of Germany in state elections in large part as reaction to what they perceive to be a top-down imposition of heat pumps in Germany. Now, I'm oversimplifying the politics of that. The point I'm trying to make is we have to have everything subject to discussion, everything subject to debate, and engage with it in debate. I think that's essential for our democratic future.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned Europe. We had a question about Brexit.
Oh yeah.
James, do you want to say?
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly jump. I'm going to jump on the environment again. I do think there is a habit, especially in the media, for people to call things that they disagree with a cultural thing. Rishi Sunak went out and they briefed to the press, on the day off and on the day, and reassured that this was not going to change much on the overall environmental target. The main hysteria for me came from the media response and indeed the environmental lobby, who said, this is nightmarish, this is terrible, it's ripping it all up. That's what I think created a lot of the concern in New York. And I was there that week, rather than number 10 and Rishi Sunak, who did what any politician would do and said things they wouldn't do and said they would. I think there is a lot of on whatever it is, whether it's on HS2, whether it's on immigration, there is a lot of jumping and people deciding basically the Conservatives are whipping something up and being very nasty when actually they're just making a pretty reasonable policy change. And also Rishi Sunak is a pretty reasonable base for policy change. He's not exactly the sort of culture warrior. So I pushed back on that. I think a lot of that is actually the media response, and indeed people on the left rather than Prime Minister himself. Brexit. Anyone talking about Brexit at the next election, not you, don't worry, is just going to get an eye roll from the public, because the public have moved past it. They voted in 2019 to get rid of it. I've used this line before, so apologies, but people called it. People say, oh, 2019, Boris won because it was a Brexit culture war. No, it was a Brexit border war. People just wanted it off their TVs, and that's why they voted for Boris Johnson. So, I think Keir Starmer has electorally potentially made a really potent error by saying that he is going to seek another deal with the EU and is going to sort of open that up. Not because the public wouldn't necessarily side on him if they're asked an polling question, but because they just do not want to hear it. So I think that almost the appearance of the B word will cause issues. There's also problems for the Conservatives, because obviously a lot of people don't feel like it's gone very well. But that is very different from permission to reopen the debate. I just want to quickly say about HS2, came up earlier in the discussion. I think journalists love the idea that, you know, announcing the cancellation of HS2 in Manchester is some sort of, you know, act of great evil and stupidity. Actually, in most of the research, especially in the red wall areas that voted for the Conservatives for the first time, especially in some of those Greater Manchester seats, it is very unpopular. And they would much rather see investment in east to west rail in the north, as well as other local investments. The line, you know, it only shaves 30 minutes off the journey. I don't even know if that's true, but that is completely sort of accepted wisdom. It's one of those lines that comes up in focus groups again and again and again. And for them, they struggle and go, well, it's a bit of a waste of time. So I think that lots of other things can happen, right? So I'm not predicting a poll bounce now. We've got Labour conference next week. Maybe, you know, Rishi Sunak will get a cough like my former boss did. It will all sort of fall apart. But on the HS2 policy itself, if that happens tomorrow, that will be an effective and successful policy electorally for the Conservatives. But they've got to make sure that they don't fall into their own trap of having their 30-minute, you know, off the journey time. If they, for example, suspend it at Old Oak Common, that's going to just sound nuts to people, I think. I don't know where Old Oak Common is.
Nobody does.
Can I,
Well, it's great.
I mean, we're going to say it's too big.
can I just, in the spirit of saying things that may be unpopular but you think are right, I'm just going to slightly push back on this HS2 thing. I think it's a 50, and I've spoken to people who closed this decision over the last few days. It is a 50-50 call. It's hugely over budget. It's hugely difficult. It's been a really hard project to implement, and that's well known. We have to be very, very careful that in this country, we still know we have the ability to do big things. I'm very worried about the pessimism coming into government, parliament, media, private sector, which is anybody proposes something big, oh no, we can't do it. Look at HS2, we couldn't do it. And I just really worry, and we've got to really examine what makes our system overall so difficult to do big things. Do we think today, if somebody proposed the Channel Tunnel, it would get done? Do we think today, if the M25 didn't exist, that it would get done? You know, we've got, as a country, we have to sometimes do big things that in the short term may be unpopular, but we cannot lose the ability to do that as a country.
Theresa, I know you wanted to come in on Brexit.
Yes, I agree with James. Like, I just don't see Brexit being a big part of the campaigning of the general election. Obviously, it's been an important change, so it will continue to be a matter of debate. But I don't see it being, you know, the headline issues that the two parties are going to battle over. I think, you know, for me, the really crucial task is making good on our freedoms to regulate our own economy in the way that we want to. And this is an interest I share with BIM. We both want to see our regulatory systems becoming much more competitive. And that doesn't mean throwing all the standards in the bin. It doesn't mean ripping out all regulation. It means doing it better. I spent 6 years as an MEP, seeing for myself the way the EU produces legislation, and it is massively suboptimal, and we can and we are doing better. So there are, you know, 2,000 pieces of EU rules that are being repealed or reformed. You know, we have seen significant change, but, you know, constitutional change on a level as large scale as Brexit really does require a huge effort to make good on the opportunities it provides. And as Conservatives, it's in our DA to favour free enterprise and free markets, and getting the right regulatory system to harness and release more of that enterprise than was possible previously, I think is, for me, one of the key benefits of leaving. And there is a huge amount more to do on that. But of course, the other issue is, if Brexit was about taking back control, yes, in theory, we've taken back control of our immigration system, but it has coincided with the increase in small boat crossings. Now, in no way can that be attributed to Brexit, because frankly, under the Dublin Convention, we were never able to return anyone to the EU anyway. But that's a subject we haven't touched on yet, but it will certainly be an issue at the general election, and we do have to demonstrate some real progress on stopping the votes, and there has been something like a 20% reduction, but a huge amount is going to rest on the House of Lords' decision on the Rwanda scheme in the next few weeks. I think that will have a significant impact on our party's chances at the general election.
Now, I said we would end at 7:10, and I would like to be true to my word. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to wrap up with one message that they want the whole of their party to hear in terms of the long-term prospects for the Conservative Party. Lee, I am going to
Sure. Well, I think we talked about, when I finish where I started, there's clearly a pathway to win, and there's clearly an environment whereby conservatism and the Conservatives can make a strong case in this general election, notwithstanding all the challenges that we've gone through, notwithstanding all the difficulties that we have had. But we've got to be pretty relentless on that, and we've got to make sure that we're all focused on that, and I hope we can do that in the next year or so. The question then comes for our movement, our party, and for all of those who support us as a whole, whether we win or whether we win very big or whether we win marginally, we're not going to lose, but whatever happens next time, the question becomes for the next 10, 15 years, what does conservatism mean in the 2030s? How do we make it work for the voters that are coming through, and how are we able to apply those principles to a different world, to the one that we've gone through? And not just how do we apply the principles, but then to Finn's hugely important point, one of the reasons why this time last year that experiment didn't work, not just what we think, but how we make it work, and how we make it work, how we make government work to implement that, and how we actually deliver things, whether it be big projects or massive reform or changes to what we need to do. That's our job. We can have all of the exciting ideas in the world, and we've got a challenge on ideas, I think, across the West in terms of, as I say, in terms of conservatism. We can fix all of that. You've still got to work out how to deliver it, and that's the second question.
Theresa.
I think issues around childcare should become much more high profile in our political discourse. And for Conservatives, we've got the most generous offer on childcare that any political party has ever come up with ever before. We're already providing more support for childcare than any government ever before, but you wouldn't really think that from the way we talk about it. Given the kind of demographic challenges that we've heard outlined on the panel, that our support amongst young people, amongst women is down, well, I think we need to start demonstrating that we have a very positive offer on childcare, which really is going to be crucial in helping with household budgets from the bottom line over the next few years. So I'd like that as a change in our politics.
Thank you. Ben.
I agree with Lee, particularly on the efficacy of government and about the need for us to completely reframe the way we think about Parliament, Whitehall, the devolved administrations, the state, what the state does, how it does it, everything from big projects to regulation. Our state, as in the biggest sense of the word, is not fit for purpose for the challenges of the 2020s and 2030s, and we have to outline in several areas how we deal with that challenge. But the political message on top of that, I repeat this point, we cannot forget younger generations. I pick up a huge frustration in this country from people who are younger. As I say, people under 40, under 45, they do not feel that the economic opportunities they have are commensurate with what they found with their parents or their grandparents. And unless we fix this problem, we're not just going to lose elections, but we're going to lose the trust of an ever-growing sector of the electorate. And that doesn't mean you lose one election, it means you lose several in a row. So I think that younger generations have to be the heart of the Conservative Party's future in this country. You look at the Canadian Conservatives, they're making an effort. You look at the Republicans in the US. I mean, I'm not a Trump fan, far from it, but it's amazing if you actually look at the age profile of what happens to the Republican vote in the US. A lot of younger people vote Republican, a lot of middle-aged people are a Democrat, and then older people vote Republican. What I'm saying is, we are highly unusual in having such a linear move away from the Conservatives amongst younger people. We can fix this, it's not inevitable. And if we don't fix it, I think our party will suffer greatly in the future.
Thank you. I'm finding James.
Well, I've got an easy cop out on this because about a week before this, we asked a focus group, what would your message be to the Conservatives at this conference and indeed to the Prime Minister? And the most common answer was stand up for something, stand up for something. And this is really the challenge now for Rishi Sunak between now and the election is he can be seen to take a clear, almost moral stance. I mean, he really believes in. Contrast that to Keir Starmer, then that will be the sort of the best short-term fix. I think longer term, let's assume that the Conservatives don't win the next election. It almost more than the ideology, the leader is going to matter hugely. But politics has become so much more presidential, and clearly Conservatives have tried their fair share of leaders in the last 10 years. But if you don't get that right, and especially if you're posing a policy platform that is a little bit harder for the electorate to swallow, smaller tax, maybe smaller state, perhaps being open on things like immigration, sort of similar to this Truss's position. It's possible, but if you haven't got a really powerful, compelling leader to take that message to the electorate, then it could go very badly indeed. And I think that's going to make the difference between whether the Conservatives are out of opposition for a term, or whether they're out for as long as they were when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. And that decision is almost going to be made, possibly even this time next year. Who knows? And that's going to be the real onus of Conservative MPs. Don't choose someone rubbish.
What a message to end on. So thank you very much. Sorry we didn't get more questions, but a huge thank you to each of our speakers for really fascinating insights and questions. So please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you very much for hosting.